Welcome back. This is the second video for the Lecture 8 on New Testament backgrounds, and we left off just kind of getting a feel for the background, historical, political background to the New Testament. So we're working our way through history. So we talked about how Persia came in and defeated Babylon while Israelites were in exile, and we talked about how they became known as Jews at this time period and adopted Aramaic and started worshiping in synagogues. The Persian king that came in and let the Jews go back to their homeland was Cyrus, and if you want to learn more about that, the Restoration Crisis is covered in Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. Probably the most influential period leading up to the New Testament times in Jesus was the Hellenistic period. If you've ever taken a history class, you know about Alexander the Great of Macedon. He is the one who came in and conquered Persia. And then he moved south through Judea, conquered Judea all the way to Egypt, and then of course spread his empire out across the Mediterranean world. And he did not just conquer lands, he also brought his culture, what we call Hellenism, the Greek culture, to the people that he conquered. And so the importance of Alexander the Great for New Testament studies is at least twofold. First, the Mediterranean world was powerfully influenced by Greek culture, and this talks about, the society stratification, the styles and clothes that were worn, the religion of the Greek empire, entertainment, things like baths and philosophy and all the different things that impacted society gets spread across the whole Mediterranean world. But what also happens is that the Greek language becomes the lingua franca of this Mediterranean world, or the language that everybody operates in on a daily basis, if you're a merchant or whatever you are. And that is the reason that the New Testament is written in Greek. Now, there are different forms of Greek. So if you're thinking about Aristotle and Plato, those are going to be more classical, a more difficult form of Greek. But the everyday language of the people was Koine Greek, or the common Greek, and that is the language that the New Testament is written in. And even though Jesus will live and the apostles will live during the time period of the Roman Empire, they were still speaking Greek later at that time. That's how strong the influence was of Hellenism during this period. By the way, here's Greek. If you're interested in it, you might know it if you've ever watched a movie about fraternities or been in a fraternity or sorority. These are the uppercase letters or majuscules, and these are the lowercase letters, the minuscules, and the names of each of the letters. And then if you're interested in how to pronounce them, this chart kind of shows you how to pronounce that if you're ever interested in reading Greek. We do actually offer Greek here at Campbell, so that might be something you'd be interested in. Just to show you kind of how Greek was originally written in the New Testament, our original and early New Testament manuscripts were written actually in all capital letters, all majuscules. So over here you'll see how there is all capital letters in Greek. There's no spaces between the words, no punctuation or anything like that. So if you were fluent in that language, it wouldn't take too much for you to read and understand that. But those of us who study Greek as a second or third language or as a research language have a hard time reading these kinds, because this is what we tend to use to translate the New Testament into English, and that is contemporary Greek New Testaments, and they're going to be mostly in the lowercase or minuscules, except for maybe the beginning of a word or the name of a person or a place. So this is what we tend to read and translate, but this is what it used to look like right here. Another concept that's important to understand in the Hellenistic period is that there was what we call the Jewish diaspora, which is a word that means dispersion. So many Jewish people did not stay in Judea or Jerusalem area. They spread out to different areas in the Mediterranean world. That was made possible because of Hellenism and how easy it was to kind of go from one country to the other when you had a common language and common customs and things like that. So by the time Jesus was born, around 6 to 4 BCE, The diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, was actually 10 times larger than the Jewish population in the Jewish homeland. It's an important thing to understand when we get to Paul and we start realizing that when Paul goes around across the Mediterranean world, he finds Jews in many, many different places, not just in Jerusalem. Here's a map that is maybe helpful for you. So here's Jerusalem, and you can see all the darker brown are where the Jewish people settled, kind of spread out. So you're going to see them in Egypt, especially in Alexandria, and up into Antioch in Syria, and all Asia Minor and other places like that. So this was in the 1st century CE or AD, what the Jewish population in the Mediterranean world looked like. An important period in Jewish history is when the Jews rose up against their Greek oppressors. So this was after Alexander died, and there was sort of chaos. Different ruling groups took over after this time. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids were in charge in different areas, but it was a very rough time for the Jews because the very dictatorial leader Antiochus Epiphanes, he made it very difficult to worship Yahweh and to also have the scriptures. He made it illegal for the Jews to have their scriptures. He tortured and martyred many people for standing up for their faith and refusing to back down from the Hebrew scriptures. And so it just was too much for the Jews, and they said that's enough. So they rose up in what we call the Maccabean War, and this was around 167 to 141 BCE. And if you have ever been around someone who celebrates Hanukkah, that is the holiday that comes around the same time as Christmas, and this is a celebration, a recognition of this time period when the Maccabees threw off the yoke of their Seleucid oppressors, and they were able to retake over the temple, which had been turned into a temple for Zeus. And so Hanukkah celebrates that time period. So the Hasmonean dynasty is the name of the ruling group that ruled Israel from 166 to 63 BCE, and this was one of the only times that the Jews ruled themselves. Jewish people were actually ruling in Israel, which didn't happen very often. And it didn't happen very long because the Roman general Pompey comes in 63 BCE and conquers the city of Jerusalem. We know a lot about this time period, the Roman time period actually, that we're moving into, not just from scripture, but also from this guy named Josephus, who was a Jewish historian that the Roman Empire hired kind of to write the history of the Jews. The Romans liked to do this. They liked to keep very meticulous notes about their conquests and the people that they were over. And so Josephus wrote Antiquities and the Jewish War about this time period, and so we were able to figure out, what it was like for the Jews under Roman rule during this time period. Of course, this extends into the time period when Jesus lived and when the Gospels and epistles were being written. So the Roman period, this is the time period of Jesus' birth. Jesus was born during the rule of Herod the Great, so around 6 to 4 BCE. The Herods, so Herod, there's not just one Herod, it was a family. The Herods were rulers in Israel that were half Jewish. Well, at least Herod the Great was half Jewish, and they ended up really just working for the Roman government. They were puppets. That's really what history will say about them. Herod the Great especially had very political aspirations. He wanted to build a legacy for himself, so he did amazing things, in and around Jerusalem. He built a harbor, he built a palace for himself, he built theaters, and one of his, there's the harbor right there. There is a sort of auditorium place, outdoor arena, Colosseum place. But his most important building project was that he redid or renovated the Jewish temple. So if you'll recall, there was, of course, Solomon's temple built in the reign of Solomon, and then that was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587, 586. And then, of course, once the Jews came back from Babylonian exile, they rebuilt a temple, but with very little, resources. So it was a modest temple. Well, here Herod beautified the temple and put gold all around it and expanded it. And so he was, to the normal everyday folk, he was popular because he did all of these things. But really, most of the reason he was able to do all these building projects is because he heavily taxed the people. And so a lot of times people didn't realize that was what was going on. Some of the important dates for you to note in the Roman period are, of course, we talked about the birth of Jesus, and we'll talk more about that later. The death of Jesus was around 30, maybe 30 or 33. We'll talk about that later. Then Paul's ministry and mission work was spanned several decades between the 30s and the 60s. The first Jewish revolt against Rome's rule, we'll call it the Jewish War with Rome, was in 66 to 70. And then one of the most important dates there was 70 CE or AD, which was the fall of Jerusalem. That's when the second temple that was just beautified by Herod was destroyed by Rome. Lots of books in the New Testament are kind of dated in and around this time period. So very important changes happened to Judaism and Christianity at this time period because of the fall of Jerusalem. And then we have another Jewish revolt in 132 to 135. The Jews were always trying to shake off Roman rule, but it was very difficult to fight against such a huge empire. So that one was not successful either. Different things we want to talk about for background to the New Testament is the diversity within Judaism. Like we've talked about Jews and Judaism a little bit, but there were many different groups within Judaism that will show up in the New Testament and also in the background. And so we're going to look at each of those: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and then the Herodians and the Zealots, starting with the Pharisees. So the Pharisees are, if you've read the Bible, you might have heard of them. They were very, very religious, very pious, devout group that did not want to succumb to that Greek culture that had spread, many years before, that Hellenism, or even to Roman culture. They wanted to make sure that they followed the law, the Torah, very strictly. And so they were very admired by the general Jewish public. These were the holy men of Israel. When they are mentioned in the Bible, however, they get a negative rap here because they tend to be the primary opponents of Jesus. They are insulted, upset by some of the things that Jesus is teaching, and so they come up against him and question him, accuse him, and things like that. But the way that the Pharisees lived ends up continuing on into history because the contemporary Orthodox Judaism movement grew out of the Pharisaical movement. So the Pharisees are important here in history and in the New Testament. The Sadducees were the ones who descended from the Hasmoneans. Remember, that was the dynasty that ruled the Jews ruling themselves. These people tended to be educated, they were wealthy, they were politically connected elites. And so when during the Roman occupation, they actually wanted to maintain their power and maintain status quo. So they tended to work with the Romans. And the Sadducees were in charge of the things that went on in the temple, the selling of animals and things like that. And so when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, they sort of died out as a group in Judaism because they no longer had their main central authority there. The Essenes are a group that's not mentioned in the Bible, actually, but we know about them because we found some scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, in Qumran just in the 1940s. And it gives us a picture of this community that had left Jerusalem, separated themselves out from the broader world, and went to live in the desert. And they thought that they were the true Israel, and they were very strict ascetics. So they, did a lot of fasting, and many of them were. They did not marry, and they, studied and studied and studied scripture all the time. It's a possibility that John the Baptist was influenced by this group, but we have no proof of that. It's just because they were out in the wilderness and they have these kind of extreme ideas. John the Baptist tends to have something in common with the Essenes, but that's another group. And then the last groups are the Herodians and the Zealots. And the Herodians are exactly what they sound like. They supported the Herodian dynasty, the Herods, and they supported the Roman government. And then the opposite would be the Zealots, who fought against Roman rule. There are more dangerous dangerous ones like the CHRS, who were basically social terrorists that had daggers and they would jump out, and kill Roman soldiers. But the Zealots also were warriors who fought against the Jewish revolts, and they also did not like the Roman Empire ruling them.